The undercroft of Carmithia had not seen candlelight in 300 years. Deep beneath the volcanic mountains where the Nightborn Covenant once ruled with absolute dominion over the territories of shadow, there existed a chamber that even memory had abandoned. The stone here was older than the bloodlines themselves, quarried before the first turning, before vampires understood they were cursed rather than blessed. These walls remembered when they housed grain instead of grief, when human hands carved prayers into their surface rather than warnings. Now they held only Seraph. She sat as she had for decades, her back against a pillar that had begun to crumble from the weight of centuries. The chains that once bound her wrists had rusted through long ago, falling away in orange fragments that she hadn't bothered to brush from her lap. What purpose did chains serve when the body itself was a prison? Her legs lay before her like broken monuments to what she'd once been, a daughter of the High Coven, third in line to the Crimson Throne, born beneath a blood moon with prophecies singing in her veins. The damage had come during the Purging Wars, when vampire fought vampire in theological fury over the question of humanity's fate. A blessed silver lance, wielded by her own uncle, had pierced through her spine as she fled with those who believed coexistence was possible rather than heretical. The injury hadn't killed her. Vampires were annoyingly difficult to kill. But it had destroyed the supernatural regeneration that kept their kind eternally pristine, eternally powerful. Her legs had healed wrong, the nerves severed in ways even immortal flesh couldn't repair. Her wings, those magnificent appendages of shadow and membrane that marked the pure-blooded nobility, had been torn by falling stone as the rebel sanctuary collapsed. They hung from her back now like tattered funeral shrouds, incapable of the transformation that would let her dissolve into mist or take to the midnight sky. Seraph was that most pitiful of creatures. A vampire who could not hunt, could not flee, could not even die with dignity. So her family had left her here. Not out of cruelty, they'd assured her. Out of mercy. Out of necessity. The Covenant was being hunted to extinction by the human Inquisition. They could not afford to carry dead weight, even if that weight bore the blood of their ancient line. They would return for her when the war was won, when the world was safe again for their kind. That had been 73 years ago. The chamber was exactly as they'd left it, save for the steady accumulation of dust and the slow degradation of everything she'd once called beautiful. Her dress, crimson silk embroidered with silver threads and patterns that told her family's 1,000-year history, was now gray with grime, torn at the hem where she tried to fashion bandages for wounds that wouldn't heal. The candles they'd left her, 100 of them to mark the years until their promised return, had burned down to puddles of wax that looked like frozen tears. She'd stopped lighting them after the first decade. The moonlight that found its way through the cracks in the chamber ceiling was her only companion now, cold and blue and honest. It didn't lie to her. It didn't promise returns that would never come. It simply illuminated the truth of her existence. She was forgotten, abandoned, left to experience the one thing vampires feared more than death itself: eternity without purpose. Her crimson eyes, the only part of her that still held the fire of her bloodline, stared at nothing and everything. She'd stopped counting the days somewhere around the 1,000th sunrise she'd felt through the stone above her, that instinctive awareness of the sun's position that all vampires possessed. She'd stopped speaking to herself after year 30, when even her own voice began to sound like mockery. She'd stopped hoping sometime after that, though she couldn't pinpoint exactly when hope had finally died. What she hadn't stopped was existing. That was the true curse of vampirism, she'd come to understand. Not the thirst for blood, not the aversion to sunlight, not even the moral weight of being a predator wearing a human face. The real curse was continuation. The inability to simply stop when stopping would be mercy. Her body demanded blood only once every few months now, slowed by inactivity and the supernatural stasis that came from feeding so infrequently. Rats came sometimes, drawn by the scattered grain that had somehow continued to sprout in the corners of the chamber, fed by water that seeped through cracks in the ancient stone. She caught them with patience that only immortality could teach, moving with agonizing slowness to position herself along their paths, then striking with the last remnants of her supernatural speed. Rat blood was thin, unsatisfying, barely enough to sustain consciousness. But it kept her from the final desiccation that would lock her mind and her body like a prisoner in an Iron Maiden. She'd seen that fate once as a child, when her mother had shown her the original vampire, The first turned, the patient zero of their entire cursed lineage. He'd been starved for 1,000 years as punishment for creating their race, his body dried to leather, his mind still aware behind eyes that couldn't even blink. Never forget, her mother had whispered, that our gift is also our damnation. We are alive forever, Seraph. Even when we wish we weren't. She understood now. The red mist that sometimes seeped from the deeper caverns below was her only indicator of time's passage. It came with the change of seasons, she determined, some byproduct of the volcanic activity deep in the mountain's heart. When it came, she watched it move across the stone floor like a living thing, curling around the bases of pillars, reaching toward her with fingers that never quite touched. She'd named it Witness because something should acknowledge that she still existed. The walls around her told stories she'd memorized through sheer repetition. Ancient markings from the human civilization that had built this place, before the vampires conquered it, before it became a stronghold and then a tomb. She couldn't read their language, but she traced the symbols so many times that her fingers knew them like poetry. Some were prayers. Some were warnings. Some were simply names, carved by people who wanted to be remembered. She understood that impulse now too. Sometimes, in the deepest hours of night when the moon was dark and even the rats were sleeping, Seraph would drag herself to the walls and try to carve her own name into the stone. But her fingernails, once sharp enough to cut steel, were broken and brittle now. The stone refused her testament. Even the walls denied her the dignity of leaving a mark. On those nights, she would return to her pillar and let her eyes close, pretending that sleep was still something she could achieve. Vampires didn't truly sleep, not like the living did. They experienced a sort of meditative torpor, a dimming of consciousness that wasn't quite rest but wasn't full awareness either. In that state, she could almost forget what she'd become. Almost. Tonight was different though. Tonight, something had changed in the quality of the silence. Seraph's eyes opened, crimson irises reflecting the moonlight like a cat's. Her head tilted, listening with senses that had become almost preternaturally acute through decades of isolation. There, distant but approaching. Not the skittering of rats or the settling of ancient stone or the whisper of wind through cracks. Footsteps. Human footsteps. Her body tensed, instinct screaming contradictory commands. Hunger surged first, the predator's response to prey entering its territory. Then came fear because humans didn't come this deep unless they were hunters, and she was in no condition to fight. Then something else, something she'd almost forgotten the name for. Hope. The footsteps were growing closer, descending the long-forgotten stairs that led to her chamber. Heavy boots on stone, cautious but not stealthy. A light flickered in the passage beyond her chamber, not torchlight but something steadier. One of those electric lanterns the humans had invented in the past century, powered by batteries instead of flame. Seraph tried to straighten herself, to arrange her broken body into something resembling dignity. Her torn dress shifted around her, dust falling like gray snow. Her damaged wings trembled with the effort of folding closer to her back, trying to hide their uselessness. Her hands moved to smooth her hair, which had grown wild and tangled, and found it matted beyond redemption. She abandoned the attempt at dignity. What did it matter? She was a monster in a tomb, and whatever came through that archway would see her as such. The light spilled into her chamber like liquid gold, so bright after the endless blue dimness that she had to shield her eyes. The footsteps stopped at the threshold. She heard the sharp intake of breath, the tiny sound of shock that humans made when confronted with something that violated their expectations of reality. Then, impossibly, a voice. Male, young, speaking in the common tongue with an accent she didn't recognize. Oh God. You're real. Seraph's hand fell from her eyes, letting them adjust to the golden light. She could see him now, a human man, perhaps in his late 20s by mortal reckoning, dressed in practical clothing that had seen hard travel. He wore no armor, carried no obvious weapons beyond a knife at his belt. His hair was dark, disheveled from his descent through the mountain passages. His eyes were wide with shock, but not with the hatred she'd expected. With pity. She hated him instantly. Leave, she managed, her voice cracking from disuse. It came out as barely a whisper, pathetic and hollow. This place is death. You shouldn't be here. But he didn't leave. Instead, he took a step forward, his light swinging slightly, illuminating more of the chamber. She watched his eyes take in the broken chains, the burned-down candles, the scattered rat bones she'd piled in the corner, the ancient symbols on the walls. His face went through a series of expressions: horror, sadness, determination. He knelt. Not to pray, not to prepare for an attack. He simply knelt on the dusty stone a few feet away from her, setting down his lantern so that it illuminated the space between them. Then he did something that shattered every expectation she'd built in 73 years of abandonment. He offered her his hand. "My name is Elias Thorne," he said, his voice gentle in a way that hurt worse than any wound she'd ever received. "And I've been looking for you for 6 months. I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here to help." Seraph stared at the offered hand, work-roughened, scarred across the knuckles, utterly human and utterly alive, and felt something break inside her that was deeper than bone, more fundamental than flesh. For the first time in 73 years, the daughter of the High Coven began to cry. Elias Thorne had always been drawn to things that shouldn't exist. As a child in the industrial heartland of Meridian, he'd collected fossils that contradicted the accepted timeline of creation, artifacts that suggested civilizations older than the church allowed for, stories that his tutors dismissed as superstition. While other boys played with wooden swords and pretended to be knights, Elias buried himself in his grandfather's library, reading forbidden texts about the wars between human and non-human, about the creatures that walked in the shape of men but held darkness in their hearts. His grandfather, a former inquisitor who'd left the order under mysterious circumstances, had never discouraged this curiosity. "The world is stranger than they tell you, boy," the old man would say, his fingers tracing scars that he never explained. "And the strange things aren't always evil. Sometimes they're just different. Sometimes the real monsters are the ones who can't tolerate difference." Those words had haunted Elias through his studies at the University of Meridian, through his doctorate in pre-Covenant archaeology, through the moment when he'd uncovered something in the restricted archives that changed everything he thought he knew about the war between species. A letter, sealed with wax that bore the mark of the Nightborn Covenant, written in elegant script that mixed ancient vampire glyphs with human language, addressed to the Inquisitor General from someone who signed herself simply, the Peacemaker. The letter had proposed a truce, an end to the purging wars that had devastated both populations, a territory division that would allow humans and vampires to coexist without predation, with volunteers providing the blood vampires needed to survive, with protections codified in treaties that both sides would honor. The letter had been dated 3 days before the Battle of Ashencross, where the vampire rebels who'd advocated for peace had been massacred by both their own kind and the human forces. Where the Peacemaker herself had reportedly been killed, her body displayed as a warning to any who would challenge the doctrine of total extermination. Except the letter indicated the Peacemaker had survived the battle, at least long enough to write this final plea. And the archival notes in his grandfather's handwriting suggested she hadn't died at Ashencross at all. She'd been left behind. Elias had spent 6 months following the trail, interrogating elderly inquisitors who remembered things they weren't supposed to share, bribing historians for access to sealed records, decoding the location markers hidden in the letter's seemingly decorative borders. The search had led him north, into the volcanic mountains where the last rebel stronghold had been, where humans no longer ventured because the entire region was said to be cursed. He'd found the entrance 3 days ago, a collapsed tunnel that led into the mountain's heart, sealed by both rockfall and deliberate sabotage. It had taken him 2 days to dig through enough rubble to squeeze inside, following air currents and ancient architectural logic deeper into the earth. He'd been running out of time, out of supplies, out of rational justifications for this obsession. And then he'd found the stairs, and the stairs had led him here, to a chamber that stank of abandonment and slow decay, to a creature out of nightmare who looked at him with eyes that held more humanity than most humans he'd known. She was crying. Elias hadn't been prepared for that. He'd prepared for violence, for manipulation, for the supernatural predator instincts that every text told him vampires possessed. He'd prepared speeches about diplomatic immunity, about academic interest, about the historical importance of her testimony. He'd even prepared, in his darkest moments of honesty, to find nothing but bones and disappointment. He had not prepared for the broken woman leaning against a stone pillar, tears cutting tracks through the dust on her pale cheeks, staring at his offered hand like it was a weapon aimed at her heart. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice raw. "Why would you look for me? I'm nothing. I'm forgotten. I'm not even the person you think I am." Elias kept his hand extended, steady, patient. "You're Seraph Nightborn, third daughter of the High Coven, called the Peacemaker by those who believed in your vision. You survived Ashen Cross. You wrote to the Inquisitor General, proposing terms that could have ended the war. And then you disappeared." Something flickered in her crimson eyes, surprise, suspicion, something that might have been old grief. "The Peacemaker died," she said flatly. "Everyone knows that." The humans displayed her body. "They displayed a body," Elias corrected gently. "But the records are inconsistent. The physical description doesn't match contemporary accounts of you. The wounds were wrong. And most importantly, your letter arrived 3 days after the battle. You were alive when you wrote it. You were alive when they decided you were dead." Seraph's gaze dropped to his hand, then back to his face. "My grandfather," she said slowly, "led the Covenant forces at Ashen Cross. When I tried to stop the killing, he was the one who struck me down. He told me I was a traitor to my blood. He told me I would rot for my compassion." Her voice broke. "He kept his word." The pieces fell into place in Elias's mind with sickening clarity. "He left you here. Told the rest of the Covenant you were dead. Let the humans believe they'd won a symbolic victory. And kept you alive just enough to suffer." "He was traditional," Seraph said, as if that explained everything. Perhaps it did. "He couldn't kill his own blood directly, the old laws forbid it. But he could ensure I died to the world. That my ideas died with me. That the Covenant would never again question the doctrine of supremacy." She looked around the chamber, her expression empty. "I suppose he succeeded." Elias finally moved, not withdrawing his hand but shifting closer, his knees scraping against stone. "He succeeded in breaking your body," he said quietly. "But he failed in everything else. Your ideas didn't die. There are humans who remember the peace proposal. There are humans who work to understand your kind rather than exterminate them. There are even rumors of vampires in the far territories who practice voluntary feeding agreements with human communities, exactly as you suggested." "Rumors?" Seraph said bitterly. "Whispers in the dark. What good are whispers when the screaming is so much louder?" "Whispers start revolutions," Elias countered. "Whispers become conversations, become movements. The purging wars ended 15 years ago, did you know that? Not with victory or defeat, but with exhaustion. Both sides retreated to their territories, maintaining hostile borders but not actively slaughtering each other. It's not peace, not yet. But it's not total war anymore either. And there are people, human and vampire both, who want to build something better." For a long moment, Seraph just stared at him. Then, so quietly he almost missed it, "Why? Why do they want peace? Why do you care?" She gestured at herself, at the ruin she'd become. "Look at me. I'm not the Peacemaker anymore. I'm not even a whole vampire. I'm a broken thing that's been rotting in the dark for 3/4 of a century. I can't walk. I can't fly. I can barely feed myself. What possible use could I be to your revolution of whispers?" Elias felt something tighten in his chest. Anger, not at her but at everyone who'd reduced her to this. At the grandfather who'd crippled and abandoned her. At the Covenant that had let it happen. At the humans who'd been complicit in creating a world where compassion was punished this brutally. "You're asking the wrong question," he said, his voice firm. "I didn't come here because you're useful. I came here because leaving you here would be wrong. I came here because you deserve to have someone look for you. I came here because when I read your words in that letter, your hope, your vision, your absolute conviction that we could be better than our worst instincts, I realized that I'd never met a human with that much courage. And I couldn't live with myself if I didn't at least try to find you." Seraph's crimson eyes widened, fresh tears spilling over. "You can't save me," she whispered. "I'm too broken. The damage is permanent. Without the regeneration, I'll be like this forever. A burden. A liability. You should leave me here and let time finish what my grandfather started." "No." The word came out harder than Elias intended, echoing off the stone walls. He realized his hand was shaking, not with fear but with the force of his conviction. "No," he repeated, softer but no less certain. I've spent my entire life studying the ways we justify leaving people behind. The historical reasons. The strategic necessities. The moral calculations that let us sleep at night while people suffer. And I'm done with it. I'm done with a world where we abandon the inconvenient and call it pragmatism. He moved closer still, close enough that his light fully illuminated her face, the sharp features that marked her as nobility, the fangs that rested against her lower lip, the eyes that held centuries of accumulated sorrow. Close enough to see the way hope and terror warred in her expression. You don't have to believe in yourself, Elias said. You don't have to be useful or whole or anything other than what you are right now. You just have to take my hand. Let me help you out of this place. And then we'll figure out the rest together. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of 73 years of isolation meeting one moment of offered connection. Elias could see her considering it, weighing survival against the safer certainty of surrender. He could see the moment she decided to trust him, even though every rational part of her screamed that trust was betrayal waiting to happen. Her hand moved toward his, pale skin against his tanned fingers, cold against his warmth, broken against his wholeness. When they touched, something happened that neither of them expected. Light. Not metaphorical, not imagined. Actual light, golden and warm, spilling from the point where their skin made contact. It spread up Seraph's arm like dawn breaking over a dark ocean, chasing away the blue-tinged pallor of her flesh. It illuminated the ancient markings on the walls around them, making them glow with colors they'd long forgotten. And it hurt. Seraph gasped, trying to pull away, but Elias held firm. The light was burning through him too, filling his veins with liquid fire, making his heart race faster than fear or exertion could explain. He felt something opening inside him, some door he hadn't known existed swinging wide to reveal a vast emptiness that shouldn't have been there. Then the emptiness wasn't empty anymore. It was filling with something else, with her. With Seraph's consciousness, her emotions, her centuries of accumulated memory pouring into him like water into a vessel. He felt her pain, her isolation, her slowly dying hope. He felt the moment her uncle's lance pierced her spine. He felt every day of abandonment, every small death that came with knowing she was forgotten. And she felt him. He knew it because he could feel her surprise, her shock at encountering a mind that wasn't trying to dominate or consume her, that was simply open, present, offering without demanding. The light reached its peak, so bright that the entire chamber looked like it was on fire, the ancient symbols on the walls blazing with supernatural radiance. Then, as quickly as it had come, it faded, leaving only the normal glow of Elias's electric lantern. They were still holding hands. But now something was different. Elias could feel Seraph in the back of his mind, not as an invader but as a presence, a weight that wasn't uncomfortable, a warmth where cold had been. And he could see in her eyes that she felt him too, that the connection was mutual, bidirectional, unprecedented. What? Seraph breathed, her voice filled with wonder and fear in equal measure. What did you do? Elias shook his head slowly, his mind racing through every text he'd ever read about vampire-human interactions. I didn't do anything. Or rather, I don't think I did this alone. The old texts mention something called a sympathetic bond, a connection between vampire and human that creates a permanent psychic link. But it was supposed to be a myth. Something from before the first turning, when humans and vampires weren't enemies yet. It required perfect synchronicity of intention, mutual vulnerability, genuine love, Seraph finished, her voice hollow. It required love. Immediate, absolute, recognized at first meeting. The old romances used to tell stories about it. About vampires and humans who bonded across species barriers and became something neither was alone. She was shaking now, her eyes wide with something between horror and awe. But I just met you. Love doesn't always mean what we think it means, Elias said, surprising himself with the steadiness of his voice even as his mind reeled from the implications. Maybe it's not romantic love. Maybe it's something simpler. The love of recognition. The love of finally being seen by someone who doesn't judge you for what you are. Seraph stared at him, and through the bond, he felt what she was feeling. The terrifying vulnerability of having someone perceive her completely, the desperate hope that he wouldn't turn away now that he knew her fully, the dawning realization that she wasn't alone in her own mind anymore. I can feel you, she whispered. Your heartbeat. Your emotions. Your kindness. It's real. You're not performing compassion. You actually care. Yes, Elias said simply. I do. She laughed, and it came out broken, jagged, beautiful. You're an idiot. You've bound yourself to a crippled vampire who can't offer you anything. You've created a connection that will last until one of us dies, and I can't die, so you've trapped yourself for your entire human lifespan in a bond with someone who's only going to watch you age and wither while I stay like this. She gestured at her damaged body. What kind of scholar chains himself to the thing he studies? The kind who realizes that some things matter more than academic detachment, Elias replied. And maybe this bond is exactly what we both need. You need someone who won't abandon you. He paused, searching for words to explain something he was only beginning to understand. I need to know that all my research, all my pursuit of impossible things, leads somewhere meaningful. That understanding can become action. That compassion isn't just a pretty word in old letters. Through the bond, he felt Seraph's resistance crumbling, felt her beginning to believe that this impossible thing was actually happening. Felt her starting to hope again, cautiously, painfully, like someone learning to walk on a broken leg. If this is real, she said slowly, if the bond is actually active, then you can share more than just emotions with me. You can share other things. Physical strength. Vitality. The properties of the bond were supposed to let humans and vampires stabilize each other. Make each other more than they were separately. Elias understood what she was asking without her having to voice it directly. You think the bond might help with your injuries? I don't know, Seraph admitted. The texts were unclear. But if there's even a chance, she looked down at her legs, at the tattered wings folded against her back. I've lived with this for so long. I've accepted being broken. But if you're offering me a reason to try healing, a reason to believe in something again, her crimson eyes met his, and through the bond, he felt the question she couldn't quite ask aloud. Will you stay? Elias tightened his grip on her hand, feeling the warmth of the bond flowing between them, stronger now, settling into something permanent and profound. I'm not going anywhere, he promised. We're bonded now. Which means where you go, I go. What you face, we face together. And if this connection can help you heal, then we'll figure out how. But even if it can't, even if you're exactly as you are right now for the rest of my life, you're not rotting in this chamber anymore. That ends today. He stood, carefully, keeping her hand in his. Can you move at all? Or should I carry you? Seraph's expression flickered with something that might have been embarrassment or might have been gratitude. I can drag myself. It's not dignified, but I've had 73 years to perfect the technique. Forget dignity, Elias said firmly. Dignity is overrated. Survival is what matters. Getting you out of here is what matters. Everything else we can figure out later. He positioned himself beside her, sliding an arm around her waist, supporting her weight as she struggled to her feet, or tried to. Her legs buckled immediately, unable to bear her even with supernatural strength. She would have fallen if Elias hadn't been bracing her, taking her full weight against his body. She was lighter than he expected, as if abandonment had hollowed her out. Or maybe it was a vampire property. Maybe without regular feeding, their bodies lost mass, became more shadow than substance. Through the bond, he felt her shame, her hatred of being helpless, her fear that she was already too much of a burden. Stop that, he said quietly, adjusting his grip. Stop apologizing for existing. You survived something that would have broken most people. You survived it alone. That's not weakness. That's the strongest thing I've ever seen. Seraph made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. You're definitely an idiot. Probably, Elias agreed cheerfully. But I'm your idiot now. The bond made sure of that. So you're stuck with my particular brand of foolish optimism whether you like it or not. He lifted her, one arm under her knees, one around her back, cradling her against his chest like she weighed nothing at all. Maybe it was adrenaline. Maybe it was the bond lending him strength. Maybe it was just the stubborn determination that had carried him through 6 months of searching for someone everyone said was dead. Hold on to my neck, he instructed. This is going to be a long climb back to the surface, and I need you to help me balance. Seraph's arms wrapped around him, her face pressing against his shoulder. Through the bond, he felt her wonder at the simple act of being held, of having another body close to hers in comfort rather than violence. Felt how long it had been since anyone had touched her with gentleness. "Thank you," she whispered against his shirt. "Whatever happens next, whatever this bond means, whatever consequences come from this, thank you for looking for me. For not leaving me here to finish rotting." Elias picked up his lantern with the hand under her knees, balanced carefully, and began walking toward the archway that led back to the stairs, back to the surface, back to a world that had continued turning while Seraph was frozen in her underground prison. "You can thank me when we're both safely above ground," he said. "And maybe after I figure out how to explain to my colleagues that I bonded with a vampire and am now psychically linked to one of the most historically significant figures in human-vampire relations. That conversation is going to be interesting." Through the bond, he felt Seraph's amusement mixing with her fear. "You're really not afraid of me at all, are you?" "Oh, I'm terrified," Elias admitted as he began climbing the stairs, his breathing already laboring under her weight and the exertion. "I'm terrified of screwing this up, of not being enough to help you, of leading you out of one prison only to find the world above is just a bigger cage. But afraid of you?" He glanced down at her face, at the crimson eyes watching him with desperate hope. "No, never that. You're the person who tried to stop a war at the cost of everything. Why would I be afraid of someone that brave?" They climbed in silence for a while, Elias focusing on his breathing, on the placement of his feet on the ancient stone steps, on not dropping the fragile, broken, impossibly precious woman in his arms. Behind them, the chamber they left continued its slow decay, the candles reduced to memory, the chains to rust, the absence where Seraph had been gradually filling with dust and silence. But the symbols on the walls continued to glow faintly, responding to the bond that had awakened in that space. Ancient magic recognizing something it hadn't seen in centuries. A human and vampire choosing each other freely, without coercion or dominance or the expectation of ownership. The sympathetic bond wasn't supposed to exist anymore. It was a relic of an age before hatred calcified into doctrine. But in a forgotten chamber beneath a volcanic mountain, watched only by stone and shadow and the last remnants of candlelight, it had returned. And nothing would ever be quite the same. The climb took hours. Elias had to stop frequently to rest, his muscles screaming protest at the sustained effort of carrying another person up an endless stairway carved into living rock. Each time he stopped, Seraph would insist he could leave her, come back with help, not destroy himself for her sake. Each time, through the bond, he would feel her terror at being left behind again, the primal fear that this was all an elaborate cruelty, that abandonment was her permanent state. Each time he would simply adjust his grip and keep climbing. "Tell me about the world," Seraph said during one of the rest periods, her voice quiet against his shoulder. "Tell me what I've missed. All I know is what you've told me, that the war's ended. But what does that mean? How do people live now?" Elias settled more comfortably against the stone wall, letting his breathing slow before answering. "It's complicated. The official end came after the Battle of Thornreach 15 years ago. Both sides had fought to exhaustion. The vampire covens were decimated, scattered into hiding. The human kingdoms had spent themselves nearly to bankruptcy funding the Inquisition. Everyone was tired. Everyone had lost too much. So they agreed to stop killing each other?" Seraph asked, and he heard the bitter skepticism in her voice. "Not exactly," Elias said. "They agreed to establish borders. The volcanic mountain ranges became the dividing line. Humans on the southern side, vampires on the northern. There's a neutral zone in between, monitored by both sides, where crossing is forbidden except under specific diplomatic circumstances. It's not peace. It's more like a very tense stalemate." Through the bond, he felt her processing this, comparing it to the vision she'd fought for. "That's not what I wanted," she said quietly. "Separation isn't coexistence. It's just organized avoidance." "I know," Elias agreed. "But it's better than total war. And there are people trying to build bridges. The University of Meridian has a Department of Non-Human Studies now. I'm part of it. We study vampire culture, biology, history. Not to find better ways to kill them, but to understand them. There are similar movements on the vampire side, I'm told, though information is hard to verify across the border." "You crossed the border to find me," Seraph observed. "Illegally, yes. If the Inquisition finds out, I'll be arrested for treason. If the vampire authorities find out, I'll probably be killed for trespassing. But some rules exist to be broken. He smiled slightly. My grandfather used to say that. He was an inquisitor once, but he left the order because he couldn't reconcile their doctrine with what he'd learned about vampires. He spent the rest of his life trying to preserve knowledge instead of destroying it. He sounds like he would have understood what I was trying to do, Seraph said softly. He did. He's the one who preserved your letter, who left the clues that led me to you. He died 5 years ago, but before he did, he made me promise something. Elias's voice roughened with old grief. He said, if the peacemaker survived, someone needs to find her. Someone needs to tell her that her words mattered. That they changed minds even if they didn't stop the war. So I promised. And I spent the years since his death preparing for this search. Through the bond, Seraph's emotions cascaded, gratitude, sorrow, disbelief that anyone had remembered her at all. I don't deserve that kind of devotion. Stop measuring yourself by what you deserve, Elias said firmly. Start measuring yourself by what you are. A person who tried to change the world. A person who suffered for her convictions. A person who survived against impossible odds. That's who you are. The rest is just noise. He pushed himself back to his feet, ignoring the protest of his muscles, and lifted her again. Come on. We're almost to the tunnel I excavated. Once we're through that, it's only another hour to the surface. The last stretch of the climb passed in a blur of pain and determination. Elias's entire body was screaming by the time they reached the collapsed section he'd dug through, the narrow passage he'd carved through tons of fallen stone. He had to maneuver carefully, sliding Seraph through ahead of him, crawling after her, emerging on the other side with scraped hands and renewed appreciation for how difficult this journey was going to be. The final tunnel sloped upward toward distant daylight, or rather toward the early morning darkness that preceded dawn. Elias could see stars through the cave mouth, bright and cold and utterly indifferent to the magnitude of what had just happened in the depths below them. Wait, Seraph said suddenly, her hand gripping his shirt. Through the bond, he felt her sudden spike of fear. What time is it? Elias checked his watch, a practical mechanical thing that had survived the journey better than his clothes. About 4 a.m. Why? Dawn? Seraph said, her voice tight. How close are we to dawn? Maybe 2 hours? Elias estimated. Why does it matter? I have a camp set up outside with supplies and... I can't go into daylight, Seraph interrupted, her words tumbling out fast. Most vampires can't. It burns. Not like fire, but it unmakes us. Unravels the magic that keeps us solid. A few seconds of direct sunlight would reduce me to ash. Elias felt ice slide down his spine. He'd known about vampire sun sensitivity in theory, but in the urgency of finding her and escaping the chamber, he hadn't considered the practical implications. 2 hours, he said, thinking fast. That's enough time to reach my camp and set up shelter. I have a tent, it's opaque, it should block enough light. Should. Seraph's eyes were wide with fear. Should isn't certainty. Elias, if you're wrong, if even a little light gets through, I'll die. Truly die. Not even the bond can protect against sunlight. It's one of the only things that can actually kill us permanently. Elias looked toward the cave mouth, judging distances, calculating times. His body was exhausted, screaming for rest. But he had 2 hours to get Seraph somewhere safe from the sun, and his camp was at least 40 minutes away through difficult terrain. Then we move fast, he said simply, adjusting his grip on her. And we don't stop until you're safe. The bond will give me strength. I can feel it already. Actually, I'm not as tired as I should be. Like you're lending me energy somehow. Through the bond, he felt her surprise. I am. I didn't realize. I've never had a bond before. I don't know how to control it. But yes, I can feel it too. I'm drawing on your warmth, your vitality. And you're drawing on my, what? My resilience? My supernatural endurance. We'll figure out the mechanics later, Elias said, already moving toward the exit. Right now we run. They emerged from the cave into the pre-dawn darkness of the volcanic highlands. The air was cold, sharp with the smell of sulfur and ancient stone. Above them, the stars were beginning to fade at the eastern horizon, the first hint of the sun's approach painting the sky with the faintest blush of gray. Elias ran. Not a full sprint. He couldn't maintain that while carrying Seraph, but a ground-eating jog that ate up the rocky terrain despite the treacherous footing. The bond flowed between them, a current of shared strength that pushed back his exhaustion, that gave him energy he shouldn't have had. He could feel Seraph's contribution, the supernatural vitality that came from her vampire nature, feeding into his human resilience, creating something that was more than the sum of its parts. The landscape passed in a blur of dark stone and twisted vegetation, the hardy scrub that grew in volcanic soil. His camp came into view as the sky shifted from black to deep blue, the tent a small oasis of civilization in the wilderness. He'd chosen the location carefully, near a cave entrance with natural rock formations that would provide additional shelter. He burst into the camp as the blue was turning gray, dawn only minutes away now. The tent was exactly where he'd left it, secured against wind, designed for the harsh conditions of the highlands. But would it be enough? Inside, he gasped, practically throwing Seraph through the tent flap before diving in after her. His hands were shaking as he sealed the entrance, checking for any gaps that might let light through. The tent fabric was thick, designed for storms, but was it opaque enough? Outside, the quality of darkness was changing. Dawn was coming, inevitable as fate. There, Seraph said, pointing to a corner where two fabric panels met imperfectly. Light will come through there. And there. Another spot near the roof. The tent won't be enough. I can already feel it, the sun's approach. My skin is starting to burn just from knowing it's coming. Elias looked around desperately, searching for solutions. His supplies were scattered around the tent. Sleeping bag, food stores, research materials, the equipment he'd brought for the excavation. Then his eyes landed on his spare clothes, the heavy coat he'd packed for cold nights. Cover yourself, he ordered, throwing the coat at her. And this. The sleeping bag still in its compression sack. And these. His extra shirt, his rain tarp, everything that could create layers between her and any potential light. He piled them on her, building a nest of fabric and insulation. Then he turned to the tent's weak points, using duct tape from his repair kit to seal the gaps, layering his research notebooks over the spots where light might penetrate. It was desperate, improvised, probably inadequate. Through the bond, he felt Seraph's fear crescendoing as the moment of sunrise approached. Felt the instinctive terror that was coded into every vampire's existence, the primal awareness of their greatest predator rising over the horizon. The first ray of true sunlight struck the tent from outside. Seraph screamed. Even through all the layers, even protected by tent fabric and clothing and Elias's desperate improvisations, the presence of sunlight caused her pain. Not the immediate incineration of direct exposure, but a burning sensation that radiated from her skin, a feeling like being slowly boiled alive. And through the bond, Elias felt it too. He collapsed beside her makeshift shelter, his own skin suddenly hypersensitive, his own body registering pain that wasn't physically his. The bond transmitted her suffering directly into his nervous system, letting him experience exactly what sunlight felt like to a vampire, not heat but wrongness, like every cell in his body was being told to stop existing, to unravel, to return to component darkness. I'm sorry, Seraph gasped from beneath her layers. I'm hurting you. The bond is making you feel it. I don't know how to stop it. Don't apologize, Elias managed, breathing through the phantom pain. This is useful information. I know exactly how bad it is now. I can plan better for tomorrow. Tomorrow? Seraph's voice was muffled but incredulous. You want to do this again? We don't have a choice, Elias said, forcing his mind to work through the pain. We can't stay here indefinitely. We need to get you somewhere with proper shelter. Somewhere I can care for you properly. My research station is 3 days' travel from here. I can carry you at night, and we'll need to find shelter each day before dawn. It'll be hard, but it's doable. Through the bond, he felt her warring emotions, gratitude that he was thinking long-term, terror that she was condemning him to days of this shared agony, desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, she would survive this. Why? She asked quietly, the same question she'd asked in the chamber, but with different weight now. Why go through all this? You could leave me here, go back to your life, find a way to break the bond. The bond can't be broken, Elias interrupted. his voice firm despite the pain still radiating through his body as sunlight filled the world outside. Not without killing both of us. Which means we're in this together now, permanently. And I'm not interested in abandoning you the first time things get difficult. We're going to get through this. We're going to get you somewhere safe. And then we're going to figure out what comes next. He crawled closer to her nest of fabric, positioning himself between her and the direction of the sunlight, adding his own body as one more layer of protection. Through the bond, he felt her shock at the gesture, her incomprehension that he would deliberately put himself closer to the thing causing them both pain. "You're insane," she whispered. "Probably," Elias agreed, settling into a position he could maintain for hours. "But I'm consistently insane, which has to count for something. Now try to rest. We have all day to wait out the sun, and I'd rather you conserve your strength for tonight's journey." The hours that followed were among the longest of Elias's life. The pain from the sunlight didn't fade as he'd hoped. It remained constant, a low-level agony that made every minute feel like hours. His body was convinced it was burning despite the lack of physical damage. The bond transmitted Seraph's suffering with perfect fidelity, and there was nothing he could do to alleviate it except wait. But he didn't leave. Didn't retreat to a more comfortable position away from her. Through the bond, he could feel what his presence meant to her. The proof that she wasn't alone, that someone was literally willing to share her pain rather than abandon her to it. They talked sometimes. Whispered conversations about nothing and everything. Seraph told him about her childhood in the Covenant, about learning to fly before she learned to walk, about the night she first understood that humans were people rather than prey. Elias told her about his grandfather, about growing up surrounded by forbidden knowledge, about the moment he decided that understanding was more important than safety. The bond deepened as they spoke, weaving their histories together, making them more than strangers who'd met in a forgotten chamber. They were becoming something new, not quite separate people anymore but not merged into a single identity either. They were a dyad, a two-part harmony, individuals who were stronger for being connected. As the sun reached its zenith and the pain peaked, Elias found himself thinking about the old texts again, about the descriptions of the sympathetic bond that he'd dismissed as romantic fantasy. They described it as a form of mutual transformation, a way for two beings to transcend the limitations of their separate natures. Maybe it wasn't fantasy after all. Maybe the bond was giving them both something they desperately needed, giving Seraph a reason to believe in connection again, giving Elias a purpose that was more than academic curiosity, making them both more than they could be alone. "Elias," Seraph said as the afternoon light began to soften, the pain finally starting to ebb as the sun moved toward the western horizon. "Thank you. For today. For every day. For not giving up on me even though you have every reason to." Through the bond he felt what she was really saying. "Thank you for making me want to survive again." "You don't have to thank me," Elias replied, his voice rough from hours of strain. "We're bonded now. Your survival is my survival. Your pain is my pain. Your hope," he smiled despite his exhaustion. "Your hope is my hope. We're in this together, Seraph. For better or worse. Until death or something even more permanent separates us." "That's a very binding commitment to make to someone you just met," Seraph observed, but through the bond, he felt her joy at the words, her desperate relief at being chosen, at being kept. "Then it's a good thing I'm the impulsive type," Elias said. "Now rest. We have a few more hours until sunset and then we travel. I want to put as much distance between us and this mountain as possible before the next dawn." They waited together in the dimness of the tent, two people from warring species, bound by something that transcended politics and history and the weight of accumulated hatred. Outside, the sun continued its journey across the sky, indifferent to the small miracle taking place in its shadow. By the time true darkness fell and Elias could finally unseal the tent, he was exhausted in ways he hadn't known were possible. But through the bond, he could feel Seraph's renewed strength now that the sun was gone, her readiness to continue despite her broken body. "Ready?" he asked, helping her free from the cocoon of protective layers. Seraph looked at him with those crimson eyes that held centuries of pain and the first fragile shoots of hope. "Ready," she confirmed. "Let's see if we can make it through one more night." Elias lifted her again, his body protesting but the bond lending him the strength he needed. They left the camp behind, He'd retrieve the equipment later if he survived this, and if he didn't, it wouldn't matter anyway, and began the long journey toward his research station, toward something resembling safety. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, bearing witness to something that hadn't existed in living memory. A human and a vampire traveling together by choice, bound by something stronger than fear, moving toward an uncertain future with nothing but each other to rely on. The world above had changed in the 73 years Seraph had spent in her chamber. But perhaps not as much as she'd feared. Perhaps not enough. Perhaps the bond that connected her to the man carrying her through the darkness would be the beginning of a new kind of change. The kind that started with two people refusing to abandon each other, even when everything in their history said they should. 3 nights and 4 days. That's how long it took them to reach the research station. A small, reinforced building that Elias had established a year ago on the edge of the neutral zone, officially for archaeological purposes, unofficially as a base for exactly the kind of forbidden border crossing he just completed. Each night followed the same pattern. Elias would carry Seraph through the volcanic highlands, navigating by starlight and the faint glow of the bond that seemed to illuminate their path in ways that had nothing to do with physical light. They would talk or fall into companionable silence, the bond weaving tighter between them with each passing hour, making them more fluent in each other's emotional languages. And each dawn they would scramble to find shelter. The second day it was a cave, deep enough to block the sunlight, but filled with the sulfurous steam from volcanic vents that made breathing difficult. The third day they found an abandoned mining facility, its stone walls thick enough to provide real protection, though the air inside was stale and dusty. The fourth day they made it to a shepherd's hut, long abandoned, but still structurally sound enough to keep out the killing light. Each time, Elias would seal them in, create layers of protection, position himself between Seraph and any potential sunlight. And each time, the bond would force him to experience her suffering as the sun rose, that terrible wrongness that defined a vampire's relationship with daylight. He never complained. Through the bond, Seraph knew he was in agony, knew it was taking a toll on his body that no amount of shared supernatural energy could fully compensate for. But he never suggested leaving her, never even implied that this was more than he'd bargained for. She was beginning to understand that Elias Thorne was perhaps the most stubbornly compassionate person who had ever existed. "Tell me about this research station," Seraph said on the third night, her arms wrapped around his neck as he navigated a particularly treacherous section of loose volcanic rock. "What makes it safe for me?" "It's built into the side of a dormant lava tube," Elias explained, his breathing steady despite the exertion. "The walls are solid stone, 3 feet thick in places. The entrance can be completely sealed with a reinforced door that I've tested extensively, no light penetration. There are storage chambers, a living area, even running water from an underground spring. I designed it to be self-sufficient for months at a time." "You planned for this," Seraph realized. "For finding me. For needing a place where a vampire could safely exist." Through the bond, she felt his embarrassment at being caught in his optimism. "I planned for possibilities," he corrected. "I didn't know if I'd find you or what condition you'd be in if I did. But I thought, if there was even a chance, I should be prepared. So I spent a year building a space that could serve as a home for someone who couldn't tolerate sunlight." "A home," Seraph repeated quietly. The word felt strange in her mouth, laden with implications she wasn't sure she could handle. "I haven't had a home in 73 years. "Then it's about time you did," Elias said firmly. "And before you argue about being a burden or not deserving it or any of the other self-defeating things you've been thinking, I can feel your objections through the bond. By the way, let me preempt them. You're not a guest in my research station. You're a resident. For as long as you want to stay. Which, given that we're psychically bonded for the rest of my natural life, will hopefully be a while." Seraph pressed her face against his shoulder, hiding the tears that wanted to come. She'd cried more in the 3 days since meeting Elias than she had in the previous 70 years. It was like he'd unlocked something in her that had been frozen, some capacity for emotional response that she'd thought was dead. "I'm going to be so much trouble for you," she whispered. "The Inquisition will hunt you if they find out about me. Your colleagues will think you've lost your mind. Your family, do you have family? They'll never accept this. And the vampires, if they learn I survived, if they discover I'm bound to a human," she shuddered. My grandfather is still alive. Still in power. He'll want to finish what he started. Then we'll deal with those problems as they come, Elias said with infuriating calm. One crisis at a time. First we get you somewhere safe. Then we figure out the logistics of your survival. Feeding, healing, whether the bond can help with your injuries. After that, we worry about external threats. I refuse to be paralyzed by potential disasters when we have actual immediate concerns to address. Through the bond, Seraph felt his underlying anxiety. He wasn't as calm as he pretended to be, but also his absolute certainty about priorities. He was genuinely more concerned with her immediate well-being than with the long-term consequences of harboring a vampire. It was either remarkably brave or remarkably foolish, and she hadn't yet determined which. You're going to regret saving me, she said, but without real conviction. Probably, Elias agreed cheerfully. But I'll regret it while making an actual difference in the world, which seems like a fair trade. Now stop catastrophizing and help me navigate. I think I see the marker for the final approach to the station, but I want to confirm I'm not hallucinating from exhaustion. They'd fallen into this pattern over the past 3 nights. Seraph using her vampire vision to spot obstacles in the darkness, Elias using his knowledge of the terrain to plot their course, the bond letting them coordinate with a fluidity that felt almost supernatural. They were becoming an efficient team, their different strengths complementing each other in ways that were more than the sum of their parts. It should have been impossible. They'd known each other less than a week. They were from different species, different worldviews, different eras. Seraph had been born before Elias's great-great-grandparents existed. Their entire relationship was built on a psychic bond that neither of them fully understood. And yet it worked. Through the bond, they understood each other with a clarity that typically took years to develop. They could communicate complex ideas with a word or a gesture, because they felt each other's emotional context. They could trust each other's intentions, because deception was impossible when their minds were this entangled. The sympathetic bond was turning them into something unprecedented. Genuine partners across the species divide. There, Seraph said, pointing to a rock formation ahead. I see your marker. And, is that a door? That's the entrance, Elias confirmed, his relief palpable through the bond. We made it. Just in time too. He glanced at the horizon, where the faintest hint of gray was beginning to dilute the blackness. Dawn is maybe 40 minutes away. We'll have plenty of time to get you secured inside. He increased his pace, practically jogging the last 100 yards to the door set into the volcanic rock. It was industrial, heavy steel with rubber seals, the kind of door designed for scientific facilities that needed to maintain controlled environments. Elias set Seraph down carefully, leaning her against the rock face while he worked the combination lock. The door swung open with a hiss of equalizing pressure, revealing darkness beyond. Elias retrieved a flashlight from his pack and flicked it on, illuminating a tunnel carved into the lava tube. The walls were smooth, glassy in places where ancient molten rock had cooled, rough in others where he'd had to enlarge the passage. Welcome to Thorn Station, Elias said, scooping Seraph back into his arms. It's not much, but it's genuinely sunproof, which I realize is the main selling point right now. He carried her inside, and the door sealed behind them with a solid thunk that echoed in the enclosed space. Immediately, Seraph felt the difference, the absolute absence of any hint of approaching dawn. Whatever sunlight did to her supernatural senses, it couldn't penetrate the layers of volcanic rock surrounding them now. For the first time in 3 days she felt safe. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber that Elias had converted into a living space. There was a camp bed, a desk covered in research materials, shelves holding supplies and equipment, a small kitchen area with a camping stove. Battery-powered lanterns provided warm light that was nothing like the cold blue of her former prison. Everything was organized, functional, clearly set up by someone who spent long periods alone in isolated places. But what caught Seraph's attention was the second chamber, visible through an archway carved into the far wall. Elias carried her toward it, and she saw that he'd prepared this space specifically for someone like her. A room with no windows, no cracks, nothing that could admit even a particle of sunlight. There was a real bed here made up with clean sheets. A chair. A small table. Candles, unlit, waiting to provide softer light than the electric lanterns. I set this up 6 months ago, Elias said quietly, setting her down on the bed with careful gentleness. When I first committed to finding you, I kept telling myself I was just being thorough, preparing for any eventuality. But I think I knew even then that if I found you, I'd want you to have a real space. Not a prison. Not a cell. A room. Seraph looked around the space. Simple, spare, but clean and carefully thought out. There was even a mirror on one wall which made her laugh, a slightly hysterical sound. You know vampires don't have reflections, right? That's not a myth. Something about the magic that animates us not interacting properly with silver backing. That's not a regular mirror, Elias said, tapping the glass. It's polished steel. No silver. I read that in a pre-covenant text and took a gamble that it might work. Does it? Seraph looked and gasped. She could see herself, the first time in 73 years. The pale, gaunt face. The crimson eyes too large for her hollow cheeks. The tangled dark hair that had once been her pride. The torn dress, the bandaged legs, the damaged wings folded against her back. She looked like something from a nightmare. She looked like death pretending to be a person. I'm hideous, she whispered. You're surviving, Elias corrected, kneeling beside the bed so he was at her eye level. There's a difference. And for what it's worth, I don't see hideous. I see someone who endured 7 decades of isolation without losing herself completely. I see someone who still has enough humanity left to cry, to hope, to form a bond with a stranger who offered her his hand. That's beautiful, Seraph. That's incredible. Through the bond, she felt his sincerity. He genuinely believed what he was saying. More than that, she could feel how he saw her, not as a monster or a ruin, but as a person with intrinsic value that had nothing to do with her appearance or capabilities. It was overwhelming. It was terrifying. It was the kindest thing anyone had ever done for her. I don't know how to do this, Seraph admitted, her voice breaking. I don't know how to be a person again. I've been a forgotten thing for so long. I don't remember how to interact with someone who sees me as worth keeping alive. Then we'll figure it out together, Elias said simply. You don't have to have all the answers right now. You don't have to be anything other than what you are. We have time, Seraph. We have this bond, and we have this place, and we have each other. That's enough to start with. He stood, stretching muscles that had been pushed far beyond normal limits. Now, I'm going to collapse for a few hours because I'm operating on willpower and bond-enhanced endurance at this point, and both of those are running on empty. But first, we need to address something practical. You need to feed. Actually feed, not just survive on rats. When did you last have real blood? Seraph's eyes widened. Through the bond, Elias felt her sudden spike of fear and hunger and shame all tangled together. Before the chamber, she said. 73 years ago. The rats kept me from desiccating, but they're not real nourishment. I've been slowly starving the entire time. Which explains why you're so light and why the bond feels like you're constantly drawing on my energy. Elias was already moving, pulling a medical kit from one of his supply shelves. I planned for this too. I'm not offering you my neck. That seems like a recipe for losing control, but I have transfusion equipment. You can feed from a bag, controlled, safe for both of us. He was matter-of-fact about it, like offering to share his blood with a vampire was just another item on a logistics checklist. Through the bond, Seraph felt his actual emotional state. Nervousness, yes, but also determination and an absolute lack of revulsion at the idea. You've thought of everything, she said wonderingly. I've tried, Elias said, setting up the equipment with practiced efficiency that suggested he'd rehearsed this. Though I'll admit I didn't plan for the sympathetic bond. That's been an unexpected complication. A welcome one, he added quickly, feeling her anxiety through their connection, but definitely not something the textbooks prepared me for. Now hold still. This is going to hurt me more than it hurts you, since I'm the one getting stabbed with a needle. He was trying for levity, but through the bond, Seraph felt what he was actually feeling. The weight of this moment, the significance of freely offering his blood to a vampire. It was the most profound form of trust he could demonstrate, the ultimate proof that he saw her as a person rather than a monster. Her hands trembled as she helped him set up the transfusion, her vampire nature recognizing the presence of fresh, living blood with an intensity that made her fangs ache. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until the possibility of real feeding was in front of her. 73 years of slow starvation had dulled her awareness of her own needs. "I could hurt you," she warned as the blood began to flow into the collection bag. "If I lose control, if the hunger overrides my reason." "You won't," Elias said with absolute certainty. "The bond won't let you. I can feel it already. There's a feedback mechanism that's making you hyper-aware of my well-being. You're incapable of hurting me, Seraph. Not just because you're too weak, but because the bond has made my survival as important to you as your own." He was right. Seraph could feel it through their connection. The way her hunger was moderated by her awareness of his physical state, the way her predator instincts were tempered by the bond's imperative to protect rather than consume. She could feed from him safely because they were connected too deeply for her to see him as prey. When the bag was full, Elias disconnected himself and handed it to her with trembling hands. He'd taken enough blood that he was visibly pale, his movements slightly unsteady. But through the bond, she felt his satisfaction at being able to provide for her this way. "Drink," he said simply, "and then we both sleep. Because I'm about 5 minutes from passing out, and I'd rather do that deliberately in a bed than accidentally on the floor." Seraph didn't need to be told twice. The moment the blood touched her lips, her vampire nature surged to the forefront. She drank with desperate hunger, feeling the rich, vital nourishment flooding through her system for the first time in 7 decades. Human blood, willingly given, untainted by fear or violence, it was better than anything she remembered. It was life itself, flowing into her, chasing away the hollow ache that had become her constant companion. She felt her body responding, supernatural healing beginning to activate for the first time since her injury. It was minimal, just the beginning of recovery, but it was there. The bond was amplifying the effect, Elias's vitality mixing with the nourishment of his blood, creating something more potent than either component alone. When the bag was empty, she set it aside carefully and looked at Elias. He was swaying on his feet, his eyes unfocused, his skin clammy. He'd given too much, pushed himself too far, sacrificed his own well-being for hers. "Idiot," she said affectionately, using her limited mobility to shift over on the bed. "Lie down before you fall down. You've done enough heroics for 1 week." Elias collapsed onto the bed beside her without argument, too exhausted to maintain any pretense of propriety or professional distance. Through the bond, Sarah felt him sliding toward unconsciousness, his body finally giving up after days of sustained effort. "Thank you," he mumbled as his eyes closed, "for not being dead. For being worth finding. For giving me a purpose that's bigger than academic papers no one reads." "Thank you for being insane enough to look for me," Seraph replied, pulling the blanket over both of them. "For being stubborn enough to keep climbing those stairs. For being kind enough to share your blood." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "For seeing me as a person instead of a monster." Elias was already asleep, his breathing deep and even, his mind quiet in the bond's awareness. Seraph lay beside him, feeling his presence in her mind like warmth in winter, like light in darkness, like hope after decades of despair. Outside, the sun was rising, its killing light flooding the volcanic highlands. But here, in the heart of the research station, wrapped in stone and shadow and the nascent safety of a space built specifically for her needs, Seraph Nightborn closed her crimson eyes and let herself rest for the first time in 73 years. She wasn't alone anymore. She was bonded. She was fed. She was incredibly, impossibly, genuinely safe. And for the first time since her family abandoned her to rot in the darkness, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, surviving had been worth it after all. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The question of her long-term feeding. The logistics of coexistence. The threats from both their peoples. The mystery of whether the bond could truly heal her injuries. But tomorrow was for tomorrow. Tonight, today rather, as the sun reached its peak above them, they had earned rest. They had earned each other. And in a world that had tried its hardest to teach them that their connection was impossible, that was victory enough. Elias woke to darkness and disorientation, his body screaming protest from every muscle. For a confused moment, he couldn't remember where he was, why he hurt this much, why his thoughts felt crowded in a way they never had before. Then awareness returned. The research station. Seraph. The bond. He could feel her in his mind, a constant presence that was as natural now as his own heartbeat. She was awake, her consciousness a patient watchfulness in the periphery of his awareness. Through the bond, he knew she'd been monitoring his sleep, anxious about how much blood he'd given, how much the journey had taken from him. "I'm fine," he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "Stop worrying. I can feel you worrying. You gave too much blood." Seraph's voice came from nearby. She'd moved to the chair at some point, giving him space. "And carried me for 3 consecutive nights. And experienced shared pain through the bond every dawn. You're not fine. You're running on borrowed vitality that I'm unknowingly stealing from you through our connection." Elias forced his eyes open, letting them adjust to the dim glow of the electric lantern she turned to its lowest setting. Seraph sat in the chair, wrapped in a blanket, her crimson eyes luminous in the shadows. She looked slightly better than she had when he'd found her. The feeding had put some life back into her features, though she was still painfully thin, still obviously damaged. "What time is it?" he asked, pushing himself upright despite his body's protests. "Late afternoon, based on my internal sense of the sun's position. You've been sleeping for about 10 hours. Seraph's expression was worried. "You need more rest. And food. And probably medical attention, though I'm not sure how you'd explain your condition to a doctor." "I'll be fine after food and coffee," Elias said, swinging his legs off the bed and immediately regretting the movement as his vision swam. "Okay, maybe after food, coffee, and some iron supplements. But I've survived worse. There was this one dig in the southern marshes where we all got some kind of parasite." "Elias." Seraph's voice was firm. "Stop deflecting. We need to talk about the practical realities of this situation. The bond is sustaining us both, but it's not infinite. I'm drawing on your life force to supplement my feeding. You're exhausting yourself providing for me. We can't continue like this indefinitely without serious consequences." Elias made his way to the kitchen area, moving slowly, and started heating water for coffee. "So we adjust," he said pragmatically. "I eat more, rest more, make sure I'm not constantly running myself into the ground. You feed regularly instead of waiting until you're critically depleted. We learn to modulate the bond's energy exchange, figure out how to make it sustainable. We adapt." "And if we can't?" Seraph asked quietly. "If the bond has made us mutually dependent in ways that are ultimately destructive? If I'm slowly killing you by existing in your life?" Elias turned to face her, his expression serious despite his exhaustion. "Then I'm being killed by the most meaningful thing I've ever done. But I don't believe it's going to come to that. The bond is trying to balance us, not destroy us. We just need to understand its mechanics better. Which means we need to research what little information exists about sympathetic bonds, and we need to experiment with our own connection." He moved to his desk, pulling out journals and notes he'd accumulated during his search for Seraph. The pre-covenant texts mentioned that bonded pairs were more resilient than individuals. That they could share not just energy but healing, longevity, even supernatural abilities in some cases. The bond was supposed to make both partners stronger, not weaker. So either we're doing something wrong or the bond is still stabilizing. Through their connection, Seraph felt his determination, his absolute refusal to accept that saving her might ultimately harm him. She also felt his underlying anxiety, the worry he was trying to hide behind academic rationalization. "You're scared," she observed. "Terrified," Elias admitted, abandoning pretense. "Not of the bond itself, but of failing you. Of getting this far only to discover I can't actually provide what you need to truly survive rather than just exist. Of watching you suffer while being unable to help." He ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "But fear doesn't change what needs to be done. We work with what we have and we figure out the rest as we go." Seraph watched him move around the research station, this strange human who'd upended her entire existence in less than a week. Through the bond, she could feel the depth of his commitment, the way he'd centered his entire life around this impossible rescue mission. It was humbling and terrifying in equal measure. "Why?" she asked again, the question that kept returning no matter how many times he answered it. "Why invest so much in someone you'd never met? Someone who might have been dead or too damaged to save, or not worth the effort?" Elias was quiet for a long moment, his hands stilling on the coffee pot. When he spoke, his voice was softer, more vulnerable than she'd heard it before. "Because I spent my entire childhood surrounded by my grandfather's regrets. He'd been an inquisitor, A good one, zealous in his mission to protect humanity from supernatural threats. And then he met a vampire, a young one newly turned, terrified and confused and desperately trying to understand what she'd become. And instead of killing her like his training demanded, he talked to her. Learned her story. Realized she was a person, not a monster. He turned to face Seraph, his eyes distant with memory. He couldn't save her. His superiors found out about his hesitation, and they destroyed her while he watched. And he spent the rest of his life wondering what would have happened if he'd been braver. If he'd chosen compassion over duty. If he'd been willing to risk everything for someone who needed help. So I'm your second chance, Seraph said, understanding now. Your way of answering your grandfather's question. No, Elias said firmly. You're not a hypothetical or a philosophical exercise. You're a person who was abandoned and left to suffer for someone else's idea of justice. You're the peacemaker who tried to stop a war at tremendous personal cost. You're someone who deserved to have people look for her, who deserved to be remembered. He smiled slightly. And yes, you're also my chance to prove that compassion can be practical. That understanding across species boundaries can lead to something real and sustainable. That the future doesn't have to be defined by the wars of the past. Through the bond, Seraph felt the truth of his words, felt the complex tangle of motivations that had driven him to search for her. It wasn't simple heroism or pure altruism. It was something more human, a mixture of idealism and personal need, of wanting to change the world and wanting to change himself, of seeing her rescue as both an end in itself and the beginning of something larger. You're putting a lot of weight on this bond, she observed. On me. On the idea that we can somehow demonstrate a better way forward. I know, Elias said. And I know that's not fair to you. You didn't ask to be a symbol or a proof of concept. You didn't ask for any of this. But we're here now, bonded, committed to each other's survival whether we planned for it or not. So we might as well make it mean something. He brought his coffee to the chair beside her, settling into it with a wince that spoke to his still recovering body. Tell me honestly, setting aside what you think I want to hear, setting aside any gratitude or obligation you feel, do you want to survive? Not just exist but actually live? Build something resembling a life again? Seraph was silent for a long time, looking inward at feelings she'd buried so deeply she'd almost forgotten they existed. Did she want to survive? Or had she become so accustomed to passive suffering that fighting for something more felt like a betrayal of all the years she'd already endured? I don't know, she finally admitted. Part of me wants to say yes, wants to believe that recovery is possible. But part of me is still in that chamber, still convinced that this is temporary. That you'll realize I'm too much trouble and find a way to leave me somewhere less horrible but still alone. That wanting anything beyond basic survival is just setting myself up for another abandonment. That's the trauma talking, Elias said gently. Which is understandable but not prophetic. I'm not your grandfather. I'm not your family that left you behind. I'm the idiot who spent 6 months looking for you and then bonded himself to you permanently. I'm literally incapable of abandoning you now. The bond would make the separation agonizing for both of us. So you're staying because the bond forces you to? Seraph asked, knowing the answer but needing to hear it confirmed. I'm staying because I want to, Elias corrected. The bond just makes that choice permanent. But it was my choice, Seraph. I offered you my hand knowing what it meant. Knowing that the old texts talked about sympathetic bonds forming between people who recognized each other across impossible divides. I took that risk deliberately. Through the bond, she felt the truth of it. He had known or at least suspected what offering his hand might trigger. He'd done it anyway. Had chosen her, consciously and irrevocably, in that moment in the chamber. You're insane, she said, but with warmth now, with the beginning of belief. We've established that, Elias agreed cheerfully. Now answer the question. Do you want to fight for recovery? For something resembling a real life? Knowing it'll be hard, knowing we'll have to solve impossible problems, knowing that both our peoples will probably want to kill us for this bond. Seraph looked at him, this exhausted, stubborn, impossibly kind human who'd given her something she'd thought was lost forever, a reason to hope. Through the bond, she could feel his certainty, his unshakable belief that she was worth the effort. Maybe he was right. Maybe she could be. Yes, she said quietly, The word heavy with 73 years of accumulated resignation finally beginning to lift. Yes, I want to try. I want to see if the peacemaker is still somewhere inside this broken body. I want to find out if the bond can help me heal. Her voice broke but she pushed through. I want to matter again. To be a person instead of a ruin. Then that's what we'll work toward, Elias said simply. One day at a time, one problem at a time, one small victory at a time. Starting with the practical stuff. Feeding you properly, getting you healthy, figuring out the bond mechanics. Then we'll tackle the bigger questions. He stood, moving back to his notes and journals. First priority is understanding your feeding needs. How much blood do you actually require for full health? How often? Does it have to be human or can we find alternatives? And can the bond help? Can we establish a sustainable feeding arrangement that doesn't leave me constantly depleted? Sarah felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. Something that might have been purpose or might have been the beginning of belief in a future beyond mere survival. The old texts say bonded humans can feed their vampires indefinitely without harm. That the bond creates a sort of circulatory resonance that lets blood be shared without significant depletion. But I always thought those were just romantic fantasies. Or maybe they were practical guides that got dismissed as fantasy, Elias countered. Let's test it. You need to feed again soon anyway, I can feel your hunger through the bond. So we'll try a proper bonded feeding, not this mediated transfusion approach. Directly from me with both of us consciously managing the bond's energy flow. See if the texts were right about the resonance effect. That's dangerous, Seraph protested. If I lose control, you won't. The bond won't let you. Elias's confidence was absolute. And we need to know if this can work, Seraph. Because if it can, it solves one of our biggest logistical problems. You won't have to hunt, I won't have to source blood supplies, and we won't have to explain to anyone why I'm constantly anemic. Through the bond, Seraph felt his determination mixing with nervousness. He was scared but willing. Trusting her with his most vulnerable flesh despite every reasonable instinct that said offering your throat to a vampire was suicide. You're really not afraid of me, she marveled. I'm terrified of you, Elias corrected with a slight smile. But I'm more afraid of not trying. More afraid of letting fear dictate our limitations. So let's be brave together and see what happens. He moved closer, settling on the edge of her bed, his posture deliberately relaxed despite his racing pulse, which she could hear through vampire senses enhanced by the bond. He tilted his head, exposing his throat, and through their connection she felt his absolute trust. It was the most humbling gift anyone had ever given her. Talk me through it, Elias said. Tell me what you need me to do. Seraph's hands trembled as she reached for him, her rational mind warring with her predator instincts. She hadn't fed directly from a living source since before her imprisonment. The hunger was intense, sharpened by 7 decades of starvation and the tantalizing proximity of his pulse. Hold still, she whispered. This will hurt initially but then it should feel good. Vampire venom has anesthetic and euphoric properties. It's how we used to feed without causing panic. And with the bond you'll feel what I'm feeling too. The satisfaction of feeding, the pleasure of fresh blood, the intimacy of sharing life force. I trust you, Elias said simply, and through the bond she knew he meant it absolutely. Seraph leaned forward, her fangs extending fully for the first time since her injury. They were sharp, efficient, designed by evolution or cursed to pierce flesh with minimal damage. She positioned them carefully over his carotid artery, giving him one last chance to change his mind. He didn't move. She bit down. The initial pain made Elias gasp, his body tensing reflexively. But then the venom took effect, flooding his system with sensations that had nothing to do with injury and everything to do with pleasure that bordered on overwhelming. Through the bond, he felt what Seraph experienced. The rush of fresh, vital blood flowing directly from source to mouth, the satisfaction of feeding properly for the first time in 73 years, the primal joy of taking nourishment from a willing partner. And something else. Something the texts had described but neither of them had fully believed until this moment. The bond resonated. Instead of draining Elias, the feeding created a loop. His blood flowed into Seraph, yes, but the bond channeled something back. Her supernatural vitality, her resilience, the fundamental vampire nature that let them survive on so little. It flowed into Elias, fortifying him, replacing what he was giving with something equally valuable. They were exchanging, not extracting. Sharing, not consuming. The resonance built, creating a feedback loop that was intensely pleasurable for both of them. Elias felt his exhaustion fading, replaced by an energy that was foreign but welcome. Sarah felt her body responding to the fresh blood in ways it hadn't been able to in decades, supernatural healing surging to life with unprecedented strength. When Sarah finally pulled back, sealing the wounds with a touch of her tongue, another vampire property that promoted healing, they were both breathless, staring at each other in shock. That was, Elias started, then couldn't find words adequate to describe the experience. Impossible, Sarah finished. That should have drained you. Should have left you weak and depleted. But you feel, she could sense him through the bond, and what she felt was vitality, not depletion. You feel stronger. I feel amazing, Elias admitted, touching his neck where only faint pink marks remained. Like I just had the best sleep of my life and woke up ready to run a marathon. What did you do to me? What we did to each other, Sarah corrected, wonder in her voice. The bond created true exchange. You gave me blood, I gave you some aspect of vampire resilience. We balanced each other. Made each other more than we were separately. She looked at her hands, at her damaged legs, and for the first time she felt something she'd lost. Her supernatural healing active and working. My healing, she breathed. Elias, I can feel my healing working. Really working for the first time since the injury. It's slow, it's still damaged, but it's there. The bond and the feeding together, they're giving me access to abilities I thought were lost forever. Elias grabbed his journal, already making notes with shaking hands. We need to document this. Test it. See if repeated bonded feedings accelerate your healing, or if this was just initial excitement. But if this is real, if the bond actually allows us to sustain each other, he looked up at her, his eyes bright with excitement and hope. Then we're not just surviving, Seraph. We're demonstrating something no one thought was possible anymore. We're proving that the old bonds can still form, that humans and vampires can create genuine symbiosis. We're proving I was right, Seraph said quietly, old grief mixing with new hope. When I argued for coexistence instead of war. When I said that humans and vampires could make each other better instead of just destroying each other. This is what I saw, not domination or predation but partnership. Balance. Mutual benefit. She looked at Elias, at this impossible human who'd given her back everything she'd lost. Hope, purpose, healing, and the proof that her vision wasn't naive idealism but achievable reality. You've given me more than survival. You've given me vindication. We've given each other a chance, Elias corrected. A chance to build something new from the ruins of old hatreds. A chance to show both our peoples that there's a better way forward. He smiled, exhaustion and exhilaration mixing in his expression. No pressure, but we might be the prototype for an entirely new paradigm of human-vampire relations. No pressure, Seraph echoed, laughing with something that felt almost like joy. Just changing the world, one bonded feeding at a time. Through their connection, they felt each other's emotions. Hope and terror and determination and affection all tangled together in ways that were becoming their normal. They were barely beginning to understand what the bond had made them, what it would require of them, what it might let them become. But they had time. They had each other. They had the proof that something everyone said was impossible was actually working. And in a research station carved into volcanic rock, sealed against sunlight and prying eyes, they began the long work of figuring out how to transform their impossible bond into something that could survive in a world that didn't want them to exist. The war between humans and vampires had officially ended 15 years ago. But the real work of peace, the hard, messy, intimate work of learning to see each other as people rather than threats, was only just beginning. And it was beginning here, with two people who had every reason to be enemies and had instead chosen to be everything else. The research station had become a home. Elias had expanded it, adding more chambers carved into the lava tube system, creating proper living spaces instead of just survival accommodations. There was a laboratory now, where he conducted experiments on the bond's properties. A library filled with texts about pre-covenant history. A workshop, where Seraph was learning to craft mobility aids that worked with her damaged legs instead of against them. And a garden, of sorts. A chamber where bioluminescent fungi provided light without requiring sunlight, where they grew plants that could sustain Elias without needing surface exposure. They'd become efficient at managing their isolated existence. Elias made supply runs at night, with Seraph guiding him through bond-enhanced awareness that let her see through his eyes. They communicated with the outside world through carefully anonymous channels, Elias maintaining his academic affiliations without revealing his living situation. And they researched, obsessively, comprehensively, documenting every aspect of the sympathetic bond that connected them. The findings were extraordinary. Repeated bonded feedings had accelerated Seraph's healing significantly. Her legs were stronger, not fully functional but capable of bearing her weight for short periods with support. Her wings showed signs of regeneration, the torn membrane beginning to fill in with new growth. Her supernatural abilities were returning gradually, each feeding session strengthening the connection between her consciousness and her vampire nature. And Elias was changing too. The bond had granted him enhanced resilience, rapid healing, senses that were sharper than human normal. He was faster, stronger, more resistant to injury and illness. The exchange was making him partially supernatural, borrowing properties from Seraph's vampire nature in the same way she borrowed vitality from his human life force. They were becoming something unprecedented, a true hybrid partnership that transcended the limitations of both species. But they couldn't stay hidden forever. I received a message yesterday, Elias said over breakfast, or rather over his breakfast and her morning feeding. From the university. They're demanding I return for review, submit my research findings, explain my prolonged absence. If I don't respond within 2 weeks, they'll revoke my credentials and send people to find me. Seraph felt his anxiety through the bond, mixed with determination. You want to tell them, she observed. I want to stop hiding, Elias corrected. We've proven the bond works. We've demonstrated sustainable human-vampire coexistence. We have data, documentation, empirical evidence that what everyone says is impossible is actually not only possible but beneficial for both parties. If we share that, we become targets, Seraph finished. The Inquisition will want to destroy me. The Covenant will want to destroy you. Both sides will see us as threats to their respective doctrines of separation. Or, Elias countered, we become proof that their doctrines are wrong. That the future doesn't have to be defined by the past. That the peacemaker's vision was achievable all along. Through the bond, Seraph felt his conviction, his desperate need to make their connection mean something beyond personal survival. He wanted revolution, wanted to use their bond as a weapon against centuries of accumulated hatred. She couldn't deny the appeal. She'd spent 73 years convinced her ideas had died with her imprisonment. The chance to prove otherwise, to demonstrate that she'd been right all along. It's dangerous, she said, but without the conviction of refusal. Everything worth doing is dangerous, Elias replied. We can stay hidden, survive in isolation, and maybe the world above eventually forgets we exist. Or we can step forward, present our findings, and force both species to confront the fact that another way is possible. They'll try to kill us, Seraph warned. Probably, Elias agreed cheerfully. But we're bonded now. Stronger together than apart. And we have something they don't, proof that cooperation benefits both sides. That's a powerful argument, backed by empirical data. Some people will want us dead for challenging the status quo. But others, he leaned forward, his eyes bright with vision. Others will see what we represent and wonder if maybe, just maybe, the old hatreds could end. If we could coexist after all. Seraph looked at him, her bondmate, her partner, her impossible salvation. Through their connection, she felt his absolute certainty that this was the right choice, the brave choice, the choice that honored both their survival and the vision she'd nearly died for a century ago. You're asking me to be the peacemaker again, she said quietly. To stand up and advocate for coexistence, knowing it cost me everything last time. I'm asking you to be yourself, Elias corrected gently. The person who believed cooperation was possible when everyone else had given up. The person who tried to stop a war with words instead of weapons. That person is still here, still alive, still capable of changing minds. And now she has proof, herself, me, this bond, that her vision was never just idealistic fantasy. Through the bond, Seraph felt the weight of his request, the enormity of what he was asking. To step out of hiding meant risking everything they'd built together. But staying hidden meant accepting that her 73 years of suffering had been for nothing, that the peacemaker had truly died in that chamber. She looked around the research station, at the home they'd created from impossible circumstances. At the evidence of their partnership scattered across every surface. At the future they could have, either in safe isolation or in dangerous, revolutionary visibility. If we do this, she said slowly, we do it together. Equal partners, not savior and saved. Your research, my testimony. Your credibility, my history. We present as a bonded pair, as proof of concept, as the beginning of something new. Together, Elias agreed, relief and excitement flooding through the bond. Always together. That's what the bond means, neither of us goes into danger alone. Seraph took a deep breath, feeling the weight of decision settling into certainty. Then let's do it. Let's step out of the shadows and remind both our peoples that the peacemaker survived. And that she's still fighting for a world where humans and vampires don't have to be enemies. She smiled, crimson eyes meeting his brown ones, two people from warring species bound by something stronger than fear or hatred. Let's change the world, Elias Thorne. One impossible bond at a time. Through their connection, they felt each other's determination, each other's fear, each other's hope for a future that neither species had dared to imagine in generations. They were walking toward danger deliberately, choosing visibility over safety, choosing to fight for possibility instead of accepting limitation. The disabled vampire who'd been left to rot in darkness had found her way back to light, not the killing sunlight that remained her enemy, but the light of purpose, of partnership, of being seen and valued and believed in. And the human scholar who'd spent his life studying impossible things had found the most impossible thing of all. A genuine bridge between species, built on mutual care instead of mutual suspicion. Together they would step forward. Together they would challenge centuries of doctrine. Together they would demonstrate that the old bonds could still form, that coexistence was possible, that the peacemaker's vision had never been naive idealism. It had been prophecy waiting for the right moment to become reality. And that moment was now. In a research station carved into volcanic rock, sealed against light but open to possibility, two people prepared to show the world that everything it believed about humans and vampires was wrong. The war had ended 15 years ago. But peace, real, lasting, revolutionary peace, was only just beginning. And it started with a disabled vampire and a stubborn human, bonded across impossible divides, refusing to accept that their connection was anything less than the future itself.